Hey there, I'm a lawyer and a legal strategist, and I teach folks in corporate contracting legal strategy that secures the bag. When I do workshops, I get three questions all the time, and I am going to answer those questions today. Do I have to form an LLC? How do I handle indemnity and insurance terms and contracts? And how do I get terms I need into contracts? We're going to talk about it all, and I'm going to give you actionable tips that you can implement today. So the first question is, do I need to have an LLC for my business? I get this question every single time because most legal advice says that you have to have these things if you're a legit business: a formal legal entity like an LLC, business insurance, a tax ID, and a business bank account. But the truth is, whether you have any of these things or all of these things is a matter of risk. So let me just back up and give you a brief understanding of what risk is so I can answer your question properly. And risk is really the financial or reputational loss due to failure to, unawareness of, or reckless indifference to laws and regulations that apply to your business. It can include regulatory violations from a government agency, as well as potential lawsuits against your business from a competitor, a customer, or what have you. There's four ways to manage risk. You can accept it, you can reduce it, you can transfer it, or avoid it. And so when we're talking about an LLC, the specific risk that we're talking about, so we understand the context of this question, is what is going to happen in the very unlikely chance that your business gets sued, and in that lawsuit, you lose, and a judge or a jury says you owe the other party money. The question is, where does that other party get to collect money from? Do they get to collect it from potentially your personal assets like your house, your car, maybe a savings account or a 401k or a personal checking account? Or are they limited to collecting it from just your business assets? So maybe just your business bank account, maybe your business's intellectual property portfolio. But where can they collect this money from? That is the question we're addressing when we say, do I need an LLC for my business? Because the truth is, you may not need one depending on your risk tolerance. So let's look at the different strategies. If you're looking to avoid the risk of having someone sue you and then you owing them money and then potentially collecting that money from your personal assets, like your personal checking or savings account, then you would want to register your business as a legal entity. Make sure you follow the protocols for keeping your business assets and your personal assets separate. So you would want a business bank account, you would want a federal tax ID for your business, and you would keep all of those things separate from your personal account. So you'd have business credit cards, debit cards, things like that that you use only for your business. And honestly, this is a great strategy for a lot of business owners. It's especially a good strategy if you're a licensed professional. It's especially a good strategy if you have a business that handles a lot of sensitive material like customer data or something else that's highly confidential. And it's also a great strategy if you happen to have a lot of personal assets. Maybe you have a home and a vacation home. Maybe you've got a large retirement account, investment account that you're like, ain't no way anybody is touching that. Or you've got a car or a home, you've got kids' college tuition investment accounts, things like that, where you're just like, nope, even if the risk is small, it's not worth the small risk. And so I'm going to have an LLC. Maybe, though, you decide to accept the risk and operate as a sole proprietor with no formal legal entity for your business, which means you're signing contracts in your personal name and not your business name. And maybe you don't have a legal entity or a business bank account or a tax ID for your business. This can work for businesses that are low stakes businesses. So sometimes I work with freelance writers, right, who are writing food recipes or something like that, or blogging about like tips for self-care. And so their work is what I would call like a low stakes business. It's not things that are like potentially harmful. Like it's just very low stakes. And so maybe it doesn't make sense for them to have an LLC and do the paperwork of that because it just isn't necessary. Also, people who don't have a lot of personal assets to lose. I've seen people who, you know, rent their apartment, don't have a car, don't have investment accounts, don't have very large checking or savings accounts who are like, meh. And that's on them. That's their risk tolerance. That's what they're comfortable with. And that's what they're well within their rights to make that kind of decision. Um, Another way you could manage this is to approach it from the risk strategy of reducing or transferring the risk. So maybe it's not worth the paperwork for you to like have an LLC and do the business bank account thing, but maybe it is worth it to get business insurance. You don't necessarily have to be registered, have your business registered as an LLC or an other legal entity to get business insurance. And what business insurance does is in the event that you get sued for work you've been doing for your business, then the insurance company takes care of overseeing the case and the litigation and managing and handling any judgment on your behalf. So that's another way to handle it. So the question of, do I need an LLC for my business? Is the answer to that is it depends on your risk tolerance. I've outlined three different strategies here that depending on where you are in your risk tolerance, what the nature of your business is, what you're unwilling to lose, you could use any of these strategies depending on the specific details of your situation, and they all would be the right strategy as long as they serve your needs. Question number two. How do I handle indemnity and insurance and contracts? As long as I am doing this work, I am sure I will continue to get this question. It's the top question from everybody, and everybody wants the answers. So, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to orient you with context by helping you understand what's at stake here. What is the risk? And so, as a small business, I've already said it's a very low chance of ever really being sued. Like your chance of being in a lawsuit is very low. But the downside of a lawsuit is high, right? But a lawsuit for a small business can potentially be business ending. And so we want to kind of balance these competing things of like, yeah, that's probably not going to happen, but whoa, if it does happen, it could be like hugely detrimental. So, what we're looking for and what your client is looking for in indemnity is that they want to shift the risk of being involved in a lawsuit to you, a small business. And so that means you're taking on not just the risk of your own business, but now you're taking on additional risk from your client that your client is transferring to you. And so you have to be really careful about this. And your goal in any indemnity clause is to narrow the scope of it. And then insurance requirements are often your client saying, like, yes, you've agreed to indemnify me, but I also want to make sure you have the money to defend me if a lawsuit comes up. And so you need to have a substantial insurance policy so that you can litigate a case and pay for litigation fees in the event that someone is suing and it becomes your responsibility. So let's look at each of these things in turn in more detail. The thing to understand about indemnity is that it's contractual insurance, right? Your client is transferring their risk of getting sued to you. The reason for that is they're saying that if we get sued and it's related to the work you did for us, in other words, it's the root cause is that there's a problem with the work that you did for us and it's harming someone else, then you should be responsible for that lawsuit, not us, because technically we didn't do it, you did. And that makes a lot of sense. And so when you're looking at indemnity clauses, your goal is to make sure the risk that your client is transferring is appropriate. It needs to be directly related to the work that you're doing for them. So if we look at this indemnity provision, I'll read it out loud for the sake of this exercise. Consultant shall indemnify and hold harmless company from and against any claims, demands, costs, losses, liabilities, expenses, or damages, including attorney's fees, arising from or based upon acts or omissions of consultant or consultant's agents, subcontractors, or employees, provided that consultant will have no liability to company under this paragraph unless consultant is notified in writing of all claims asserted and actions instituted against company and is given the opportunity to defend the same at his or her own cost and expense. So first of all, this is just a horrible sentence, right? Like it's like a run-on sentence is very hard to track. But what I want to say about it is that even though it's short, so when you look at this clause, a lot of times my experience with my lowercase legal members is they will look at an indemnity clause, it'll be short, and they'll be like, okay, that's probably fine. But if indemnity clause is like a whole page or like a few paragraphs, there's like, oh, there must be something bad in there. But what I want you to understand about an indemnity clause is that the integrity is in the specificity. So a lot of times when they are longer, it's because they're stating all the specific scenarios where indemnity applies and where it doesn't. So we know exactly what risks are being transferred to you. Whereas with this paragraph, it might be short, and yes, it's a run on sentence, but it's also super vague. It doesn't have any constraints, really, right, to your indemnity. It says against any claims, demands, costs, losses, liabilities, expenses, or damages arising from or based upon acts or omissions of consultant or consultant's agents. And it's like, in relation to what? Their acts or omissions in relation to what? It has to be tied to your agreement. It has to be tied to the services you're providing. It can't just be any old thing because then technically indemnity could extend to something you randomly post on social media as part of your marketing platform, regardless of whether it has anything to do with your client. So, this is where, when you're looking at indemnity, you want to be focused on narrowing the scope. A lot of people get caught up in the fight of, like, oh, I need mutual indemnity. And in some cases, that is absolutely true. Like, you do need mutual indemnity. But the thing that you need more than mutual indemnity is a a narrowed scope of your indemnity obligation to your client. That's always your first priority, and then depending on what industry you're in, what risks your business face, you may also need to advocate for getting mutual indemnity from your client. So the first thing I always tell people to do is replace any language that says, you know, based upon, related to, arising from, replace that language with the phrase directly related to. And then after that, it should specify some kind of your like work you're doing under this agreement. So some of the specific circumstances that usually are okay in indemnity clause are things like your breach of the agreement, your breach of warranties and representations under the agreement, third-party intellectual property infringement claims concerning your work under the agreement. These are some examples of specific situations where, like, if you breach the warranties and representations and it harms a third party, yes, indemnity applies. If your work allegedly infringes upon the intellectual property rights of a third party, yes, indemnity applies. So we start to get something clearer than what was originally written here, which honestly could be any old thing where indemnity applies. Now let's talk about insurance requirements. So, the reason that your client likes to include insurance requirements in a contract is they want to make sure you can pay for a lawsuit, right? What good is your indemnity obligation to you if you can't afford to pay for a lawsuit? And insurance really solves that issue. If you have to have a hefty insurance policy, $2 million, sometimes $5 million, I've seen in contracts for consultants and freelancers who are working with corporations, they're saying, we want to make sure you have something in place to be able to handle a lawsuit, especially if it's related to intellectual property infringement, because those lawsuits are very expensive, friends. I've litigated a good amount of them. Okay, so here's a way to handle insurance requirements. The first thing you want to do is you want to adjust how you're thinking about contract negotiations. It doesn't start when the contract lands in your inbox, it starts during the sales process. So I always tell people that you need to be asking a certain set of questions upfront. And if you want to know more about this, I have a blog post that I'll link below this video. So you can read it and understand what kind of questions should I be asking my client upfront before I give a price. So I'm pricing my contract appropriately. Because sometimes getting an insurance policy, what makes it really, really rough is you find out after you've given the price. And so now you have this additional sunk cost that you didn't plan for. But if you know about the insurance requirement ahead of time, you can get a quote. You can get the insurance policy in place if you want to, and then you can add the cost of the insurance to your price so that your client is actually paying for the insurance that they're requiring you to have. The other thing that you can do, because sometimes the insurance policy requirements are just so high, like a $5 million insurance policy, and you can put it on a third party. So, one of the things you can say is that I can try to get this insurance requirement met, but I can only do it if my broker agrees to it. So, you kind of like take the responsibility off of you for the meeting the contract term and say like I can only agree to this if the insurance broker agrees to give me a $5 million policy. And that's actually a really reasonable position to take, because if you can't get a $5 million policy from an insurance broker, then you can't agree. And there's nothing for your client to do about that. You can come back and say, hey, they wouldn't give me 5 million, but they would give me 1.5. Like, is that acceptable for us to move forward? So that is kind of how you can handle those clauses in your contract. Let's move on to question three, which is, how do I get terms I need into contracts? So, the biggest thing that I tell people when they're going into a contract negotiation is that you need to know what your leverage points are. So, a lot of times, your client in a corporate contract, the place where you have the most wiggle room is where you're filling in information about. Um, the services and deliverables you're going to be providing and how much it costs and how you're going to get paid. So I always tell people to take that section very seriously. Again, the rule is integrity is in the specificity. So you want to have very clear set of services, very clear set of deliverables, and how you're going to get paid. Is it going to be 50% upfront? Is it going to be 30% upon the contract signing? And then 20% when you complete phase one, 30% when you complete phase two, and 20% when you finish the project. However, you want to phase it out, you want to think about what do you need? How do you need cash to flow in this contract so that your business is financially stable throughout the term of the contract? And then once you have that, you're going to design your payment schedule and scope of work around how those things work. Then the other thing you really want to pay attention to as a leverage point is making sure there's clear terms about how you're going to get paid if the contract ends early. We've all been in situations where a contract ends early, you've completed work that the client hasn't paid for. How are they going to pay you for that? Do you have a specific process? Is it easy enough to look at the scope of work and see a value for the type of work you've completed, but the client hasn't paid for yet? And so it's just a matter of invoicing them? Or is your work kind of hard to put a value to, and do you need to say you're going to be paid for work that hasn't been paid for by the client at an hourly rate? Whatever it is, you just want to make sure you have that in the termination section of your contract. And then the last thing that I love to do is to say that the client doesn't get any IP rights, doesn't get ownership to your work or the right to use your work until they have paid you in full. This is a great leverage point. If for some reason the client's late on payment, you can just send them a reminder like, hey, you can't use this until you pay me. You don't even own it until you pay me. And that's like a great motivator for them to get a bill paid. The second thing you can do is you can add a policy section to your contract. I really encourage people to do this because it sets expectations and boundaries with your client. So you can tell them things like what your working hours are, how they're allowed to communicate with you and when, via email, via Slack, via phone. How do you want them to communicate with you? You can say, like, include a delays policy. Like, how are you going to handle delays if they are non responsive? Um, Include an access policy if you need access to their, like, Google Drive or some other storage thing, or they need access to yours, you can include that in there. And then if your client has concerns about your use of AI in what you're creating, you can say exactly how you use AI to perform your work so that everybody is clear on how it's being utilized and how it's not being utilized, and you have the same expectations going into the working relationship. Okay, the key for getting your terms in the contract is making sure your terms count. When I have it ready, I'm working on it right now. I am working on a contract clauses that you need to know series, and the first one in there is called a merger clause. And I won't get into what that is right now, but what I want you to understand is that whatever you want in the contract or whatever you need the client to agree to needs to go in the contract. So the scope of work needs to be incorporated into the contract by reference. We are not doing things like agreeing to work out payment terms over email. We're not doing things like having the client sign your contract and their contract as well. We're not going to have two contracts. We want one contract, because only only one of those contracts is going to rule the situation. So everything that you need, in terms of how you want to have a successful working relationship with your client, including how you're going to get paid, any project timeline, scope of work, services, how the contract can end, late fees, all of these things, it needs to be in the contract, whether it's in there specifically or it's in there attached as a scope of reference, and the scope of work, and the scope of work is incorporated into the contract by reference. Whatever it is, put it in the contract, please, 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 because when you agree to work this stuff out via email, and then if there's a problem, what happens is that none of the stuff in that you've negotiated via email is part of the contract, and therefore it's not enforceable. And so then you're left with hoping that the client keeps their word instead of having a contract to fall back on and stand your ground in case, clients from time to time can be a little annoying. They can be a little shady. And so you want to have everything you need in the contract to back you up when they start kind of acting sideways. So to recap, whether you need an LLC depends on your risk tolerance, what you're unwilling to lose, and your specific business situation. When you're looking at indemnity terms in a contract, integrity is in the specificity. Remember, this is contractual insurance. They're transferring the risk of being sued to you. And so you want to narrow the scope of your indemnity obligation to your client as much as possible. For insurance requirements, they're really there to make sure you can afford to pay for a lawsuit if your indemnity obligation gets triggered. You want to ask about them before you give your client a price so that you can pad the cost of insurance into the contract price. And then lastly, to be enforceable, your terms need to be in the contract, okay? And what I will share as kind of a key takeaway is that contracts are really about defining the working relationship. So, whatever you put in your contract, you want to be thinking about what do I need from a business standpoint for this working relationship to be successful, both for me and for my client. And so that is how you're going into contract negotiations. This is not like a tit for tat situation. You're not playing a game of poker. You're trying to meet in find the middle ground where you can have a successful relationship with your client and get your needs met. That's what your goal is. And you want everybody to be on the same page and set expectations that people understand and can follow. All right, that's all from me. If you don't know me, I'm Brianna. I'm the lawless lawyer, and I'm tired of watching big corporations take advantage of the little guy. Okay. What I call y'all is underdogs, the freelancers and consultants who work in corporate contracting. I use my experience as a former litigator, former in house counsel for a bunch of startups, and also a former consultant, a former small business who was a corporate consultant for a lot of these big tech companies, um, to share with you legal strategy that secures the bag. So I'm giving you the ins and outs of how to navigate these corporate contracts in a savvy way that helps you get better client deals. If you're interested in working with me, I have a lowercase legal membership where I'm teaching you all of my contract strategies for corporate contracting so that you can land better deals with your clients that pay you better and that facilitate better client relationships. I have a fix my template mini offer where if you just have a service contract that you absolutely despise, you can fix it in an hour or less using my mini tutorial. I have template contracts in there for freelance writers, consultants, and coaches. And then I have a 40-minute video tutorial and 20-page guide that kind of walks you through customizing a service contract. You can also join my newsletter. I'm going to drop links below on this page to different blog posts that I think might be helpful based on what I talked about in this presentation. Definitely check out the one on the beginner contract negotiations 101. Check out the one that I am going to add about scope creep. And when it's ready, I'm going to have the one for about merger clauses and why they're so important and why you need to know what they are in contracts. So stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.